Howdy folks, this is Big Sam. I had one of our wonderful viewers in Poland named Geshu ask me a little bit about Chinese Mosins and what my thoughts were on them. I feel like I've had a lot of questions about these guns. There's a lot of interesting misconceptions out there about these rifles and what they are and what they're not. So I want to do my best to clear up at least some of the big things here today. Now in particular, what we're going to be focusing on is the topic of quality. And y'all know that we talked about this with Finnish Mosins, trying to debunk some of the myths about how they're higher quality. Some of those myths are true, some of them are false. Kind of the opposite happens to be the case with this rifle, though. A lot of the myths out there say that this rifle is low quality. At least that's how it has been in the past. Now, is that true? Is this rifle lower quality than, say, its Russian M44 counterpart? Or maybe some of the other M44 variants, like the Romanian M44 variant? Well, we kind of have to define what it means to be lower quality. Are we talking about the machining? How nice the machining of the receiver looks? Are we talking about, like, the Brunel hardness of the receiver or the bolt face or anything like that? There's a lot that goes into what is quality, folks. But if we sort of looked at quality as a whole of all of those components and then some, the answer would actually be, this is a very high-quality gun. Contrary to what some people might tell you. Now, unfortunately, with these guns, there's a lot of, I guess for lack of a better term, gun show lore that's been floating about that these rifles are cheaper or lower quality. Low quality or at least lower quality. But that's not the case. But why is it that that myth came about? Well, I remember back in the days when I was growing up, there was a lot of cheap Chinese guns out there. In particular, I don't remember seeing these so much, but I do remember seeing a lot of Chinese SKSs. And let me tell you, those guns were cheap. You could get those for like $50, $75 probably. This would have been like 15 or 20 years ago. Just incredibly cheap guns. So I think we had this myth get created from, on one hand, these guns were incredibly cheap. These SKSs were. So you have that, but then you also have the fact that here in the last 20 years, think of all of the low-quality, cheap Chinese junk that you've seen for sale at places like your local Walmart or dollar store. And it just doesn't stop there. I mean, remember that cheap Chinesium AIM Sport rail we looked at? There's been a lot of low-quality metal imported from China into the U.S. in the last, like, 20 years or so. And that's often created this myth of, oh, that's cheap Chinese junk. I want to buy American. Okay, without going too far down that rabbit hole, this is not a one-way street, right? A lot of people like to live in a box where stuff made in China is, let's say, lower quality than stuff made in America. That's just not the case. Another example involving guns would be Chinese AK pattern rifles. Now let's take a look, before they were banned, let's take a look at some of the older, the Polytechs and the Norinkos that were imported. Well, I think back in the day, a lot of people probably frowned upon those as being cheap Chinese junk and, oh, I don't want one of those, I want something made in America. And so a lot of those people instead, since then, in the last 5 or 10 or even 15 years, maybe went out and bought something like an American-made AK, maybe an Interordnance, or one made by Century Arms. Yeah. The problem there is, in that particular gun, most American AKs, at least until recently, have been very dubious at best in terms of quality. When we look at the components they use to produce the trunnions, to produce the bolt components, generally the barrels were okay, but some of the actual main components, the pressure-bearing components, were extremely dubious. So we had this weird situation where you had a lot of people saying, I don't want the Chinese junk, give me an American-made gun. And those people went out and bought a lot of American-made AKs that were really ticking time bombs. I can't tell you how many times I've seen pictures of Interordnance or Century Arms AKs where the locking lug sheared off of the bolt while they were shooting it and the gun exploded on them. I have seen that happen numerous times from pictorial evidence. That is scary. While in the meantime, the people that bought the Chinese AKs get the final laugh, because now all of those guns, people have realized, wow, those are actually really high quality guns, and they've gotten quite expensive. Now, AKs are a little bit different than Mosins here, but I bring this up as a point. This gun in particular is a very high quality gun, but if you don't have a lot of experience with it, if you've never used one or you've never looked at a bunch, and you have these preconceived notions about what a Chinese gun is or isn't, that can really affect what you think of a rifle like this. But it's not necessarily fair to look at something produced very cheaply in a Chinese sweatshop and apply that same logic of that it's cheap to everything made in China. That's not true. There's plenty of exceptions. There's way too many to go down the rabbit hole of. A lot of the stuff we have that preconceived notions from is just because it's built to a price point. China can produce stuff a lot cheaper than we can in America. Just things of like, the communists have total control over labor. They can afford to run sweatshops, and they allow sweatshops to be run where the wages are extremely low and the work conditions are extremely low. So we get really cheap goods all over the world from China. But they also make a lot of really high quality stuff as well. I mean, look at some of these brand new Chinese smartphones that are coming out. I mean, they're cutting edge stuff. Those aren't cheap though, right? So you can buy cheap Chinese stuff. You can buy expensive, really high quality Chinese stuff. Same goes with American stuff. You can buy really cheap American stuff, like a McDonald's hamburger, not super high quality, but it's very cheap. Or you can go buy, a porterhouse steak at a really nice steakhouse. It's kind of the same principle. And I like food, so there's a good analogy for you. So this is more of a porterhouse steak, though, but it doesn't really look like a porterhouse steak. It looks like a dirty, beat-up Mosin. In fact, though, I strongly suggest that if you haven't already, to at least handle one of these rifles. Not only are these rifles high quality, in fact, generally speaking, if you took a Russian-made M44 rifle and put it next to this, I would generally prefer this rifle, this Type 53. Now, why is that? Well, a lot of times when we look at a Russian M44 rifle, it was produced during the war. And especially in the early parts of 1944, a lot of those guns were, you can tell that they were making them as quickly as they could, and they did cut some corners in terms of things like fit and finish. Not the end of the world. Those guns are still very high quality. They're nice guns. They're very strong, theoretically very safe, but you should always have yours inspected, obviously. Very, very nice guns, but they may not always look that nice, and you'll see a lot of interesting machining marks on them. And the bolts won't always be super smooth, and the triggers won't always be that nice. My experience with a Type 53 rifle has been, these guns, the quality seemed pretty even, right? We don't see a crazy deviation where, in one year, these guns were, it looked like they produced them really, really quickly, and then in some years, they really took their time to make it look nice. Pretty much all of the ones that I've seen look pretty nice. Now, that being said, I'm not going to include in there the things like Vietnam bringbacks, because a lot of those guns were sitting in a swamp for days, and they look really horrible. But that's really no fault to the gun or the gun manufacturer, the Chongqing Arsenal in China. It's just because it was sitting around in a swamp in the jungle, and of course it's going to be all horrible after that occurs. But that's not what this rifle is. This one, it was imported by Century Arms, and what's important about this one, and pretty much all of the Type 53s you see, they weren't refurbished like the Russian Mosins are refurbished. The 9130s, the M44s, those guns, you'll see the refurbishment marks, and you'll see they've all been re-blued, and kind of, if you're standing kind of far back, they look really nice, but once you start handling it, they don't always feel that smooth. They can feel a little bit rough. The beauty of having a non-refurbished gun like this is they tend to be a little bit more smooth and a little bit more polished. Now, in particular, the bolts, I mean, you can feel, this is like butter, folks. I don't know what it is about these Chinese Mosins, but they always feel just smooth like butter. The bolts on these are almost second to none when we're talking about Mosins. Just super, super nice. Now, obviously, like the Hungarian ones and the Polish ones, those are really nice too. I mean, those might even be a little nicer than these, but how much nicer? There may not be any appreciable difference for the large number of the ones you look at. Once you get to a point with Mosins, the Mosin itself is a rather crude design by modern standards. So once you get to a point where it's, you know, pretty smooth, there's not much more you can improve the gun itself without actually changing the overall design. Because you're still going to have, you know, the bolt's still going to be kind of sloppy, right? No matter how smooth this gun is, and this gun's about as smooth as it's going to get. You know, the trigger may still not be the nicest in the world. And it's not, but it's not bad, especially for a Mosin. Bayonet fitments, not too bad. It's actually pretty nice. The stock is in really good condition overall. I mean, it may not look like it. You might say, well, that looks really beat up. Well, it's got a lot of character and dings, but that's what's really cool about these guns. When we look at M44s, generally, all the Russian ones you find, usually, all the Romanian ones and the Hungarian ones you find, and the Polish ones, they all generally look pretty much brand new. Not always. There are exceptions to each one of those, but generally when you find them, they're going to be pretty close to brand new looking. And that's cool if you like that sort of thing from a collectability perspective. That's not really what I look for, though. I'm more interested in character. Y'all know that. I like Mosins for the character and charm that they have. And that's why I love unrefurbished rifles so much, especially this one. This has this got some scratches on it. It's got some wear on the bluing, but nothing too crazy. Just enough to give it some charm. And you can see all these little dings in the stock all over the place. Who knows where this rifle has been, folks? This could have been used in, I don't even know how many different places. You know, we can't talk about every aspect of these guns today because we're really focused on the quality, and this video would be way too long. But these guns are really, really nice. And again, if we ever look at the smoothness, and we compare, generally speaking, the smoothness of actions, the Type 53s are going to be right up there. Case in point, I had a 9130, and I had a extra Mosin Nagant bolt laying around, and actually I bought a spare one. This is an interesting story. I bought a spare Mosin bolt online, not knowing what type it was. Not knowing the manufacturer, the year, or anything like that, just a spare Mosin bolt. Okay, so I buy it and it gets here, and then I come to find out by the serial number, and we'll talk about that another day, that it was actually a Chinese bolt. And I was a little bit disappointed because I was like, oh, that's not as interesting. I wanted a Russian bolt. This was still really early on in my days of interest in Mosins, folks, so that was unwarranted. But those were my particular sentiments at the time, as wrong as they were. Well, come to find out that I tried that bolt in some guns, and I said to myself, wow, the action is way smoother now. So I specifically was thankful that I had that bolt and put it in a rifle just to make the action smoother. These bolts seem to be extremely well polished. Now, generally, you should see that as well with, like, the Hungarian guns and the Polish guns, etc. But, again, those people don't really question the quality of those guns as much as something like this Chinese one, where there's still a little bit of misconception out there. This gun's right up there with just smoothness and overall tightness. It is fantastic. The bolt doesn't even match on this gun, but I wouldn't change it. I mean, if I found the matching bolt, it might not even be as nice as this one is, so I'm just going to leave it like here for now. And I say that, as you can see, I'm getting all of this wonderful cosmoline on my hand because I'm out here in the sun, and it's really heating up the stock, and it's going everywhere. I love the smell of Mosins in the afternoon, folks. This is a beautiful thing. Oh yeah, and you can see it running down the back of the stock here on the comb. I love it. Nothing like cosmoline on a Friday afternoon, folks. So what have we learned here today? Well, if someone ever tells you or asks you if Mosin made in China are cheap junk and they're lower quality, you now know the answer to that is no. I mean, this one is pretty beat up. The crown actually looks almost brand new. It hasn't even been counterbored. The bore, as I recall on this one, is basically immaculate. So, the steel quality on these guns is very good from everything I've seen in my experience with them. I don't really see any appreciable difference in terms of steel quality with the Russian guns. It's even possible these are a little bit nicer than some of the wartime guns, but I'm not going to say that. I'm just saying it's possible. We would have to actually conduct scientific analysis to figure that out. But another interesting point that I want to make here is that the Chinese, it's not an accident these guns turned out nice. They specifically went out to make these guns, and when they did, they were going to make nice guns. The Russians, the Soviets, in the 1950s helped them get production set up at the Chongqing Arsenal. And when the Soviets did that, I'm sure they totally oversaw the production, because let's face it, if you're going to go help your counterpart bring up production and produce potentially millions of these rifles, and they're going to be your ally, you're not going to want them to make them with bad steel, because you know these are going to be end up being used in wars and proxy wars down the road, right? In Vietnam and Korea, down in even in Cambodia, down there, in some really terrible conditions, and these guns thrived very well. Why would you bother going through all that trouble to help your allies set up production and then give them garbage steel? It doesn't make any sense, and they didn't. That didn't happen. These guns are very nice. The Chinese SKSs are very nice guns. The Chinese AKs are very nice guns. China, there's certain things they cheap out on, but when it comes to arming their armies, they didn't cheap out. I mean, they did it proper. They did it right, and this gun is a perfect example of that. So, I think these guns are kind of underappreciated right now. Maybe a little bit monetarily, certainly historically, but if you ever get a chance to get your hands and on one of these guys and snag one for yourself, I recommend it, because this is pretty unique. This is a lot different from your standard Russian refurbished 9130 rifle. And it's always cool to have a folding bayonet as well. These have the nicer Type 2 style bayonet assembly, so it's a little bit easier to use than the wartime ones, the Russian ones. Just a fabulous gun. These have so much character, so much charm. So I really hope you guys, maybe I got you a little bit more interested in these if you weren't already. We do a lot of stuff here, folks, so chances are if this gun got you interested, or I got you interested in this gun, yeah, there's probably going to be a lot more where that came from in regards to other guns. So, maybe not pull the trigger on one of these yet unless you find a good deal, but keep this in mind if you're looking for a Mosin, because this is a really good option. You know, and the stock's already all beat up, so you strap this on your back and take it out in the backcountry somewhere on a hunting trip, and if you get some dings in the stock, you probably won't even be able to tell because it already had a whole bunch in there. It's a Mosin, folks. What's not to love about it? Alright, well until next time guys, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed taking a look at this cool Type 53 carbine here today. Let me know if y'all have any prayer requests, and we'll see you next time.